Alrighty, hey everyone. Thanks very much for joining Sheridan and I today so we can provide the FHIR community with some level setting on the Canadian FHIR baseline profiles, but actually more importantly with some more important information for folks who are curious and eager to hear how you might start using these profiles for your work and how you can get involved along the way as we continue to mature these profiles, the Canadian baseline profiles, that is. Before we jump into the work in earnest, just wanted to do some context setting that Sheridan and I both co-facilitate this work, and that the work is the product of both the input and the effort from many diverse members of the Canadian FHIR implementers community. So it's been a few years now that we've been at this, really just wanting to make sure that we're giving credit where it's due to all the folks that have been putting in their time every Friday on this work. So really a big shout out to all of them. Now, likely you've heard a lot about our work with the Canadian FHIR baseline profiles just in your various conversations, and if you're in touch with the various FHIR communities across the country. But just for some quick reference, the Canadian baseline set of FHIR profiles are essentially a slightly more constrained starting point for creating FHIR profiles for usage in the Canadian realm, where similarly to the way that FHIR is meant to reflect 80% of rules and are meant to be 80% applicable, the constraints that we have placed on our in our Canadian baseline profiles are those that are found to occur in something as close as possible to 80% of the use cases we've surveyed where the FHIR resource has been profiled. And a really important part of defining what the Canadian baseline is by clarifying what in some ways what it isn't, which is that the Canadian baseline profiles are not meant to be an out-of-the-box set of profiles to just be implemented right away. They're meant to be a starting point for your profiles that you build for your specific projects. And just to, again, as a bit of as a context setter, some of the benefits that we'd like to make sure that folks are aware of in terms of, why have these Canadian FHIR baseline profiles and why these would be effective profiles to be starting points for your iGuides. A big part of that is around consistency. So regardless of what jurisdiction you're in, regardless of what project you're doing, or even just for that matter, what domain or what use case you're in, if you're deriving off of the Canadian baseline profiles, that means that across all of those different use cases, where again, certain vendors or technologies or implementers are going to be implementing across those different boundaries, the usage and the derivation across Canada of the baseline profiles will help ensure that there are at least some common decisions and rules that are constant across all of those different areas. Again, part of that in relationship to the consistency means that it's a reduction of time and effort around actually having to create new implementation guides so that you don't have to start from scratch every time there's a new implementation, again, coming from that common starting point. And so those are really the main benefits. And what this has also done in our efforts to build out these profiles is it's acted as another motivator and a catalyst for new and improved Canadian tools when it comes to FHIR profiling. So a lot of our work, and as you'll see as we go through the other sections of this presentation, is that the work has created the necessity for even more technologies, even more approaches to validation. So again, it's sort of in an indirect way, it's led to some benefits in that space as well, in terms of what Canadian implementers have access to. So as you can see from these benefits, the majority of the aspect of the benefits of the Canadian baseline really lie in their derivation. So there are a few ways that implementers can use or derive from the baseline. And so Sheridan's going to be walking us through these approaches now.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. I don't know if you caught, but Mike kind of alluded to the fact that we operate in a pretty unique and challenging space within the Canadian baseline. The work has been developed through these grassroots and volunteer efforts, which means, unlike some implementation guides that are authored, we're not coming from a place where, we're aligning to or we're dictated by a formal policy or a program that says, here is how you're going to adopt this specification in this particular ways. And these are the incentives and disincentives, or sometimes we call them carrots or sticks, that are tied directly to that adoption. And so, we've done a lot of work in our governance stream to identify, what does a path forward look like from this very grassroots approach to ultimately the creation of a collaborative enforcement body that will and can enforce the use of the CA baseline and perspective guides across the jurisdictions. But ultimately, that's an end goal that, you know, requires a good deal of kind of maturity and stability of the content, and that you know, requires a maturation of our governance process as well. So in the meantime, what we've done is we've outlined a number of mechanisms that are available to implementers, you know, for their adoption and testing of these profiles, that allow for them to not just improve their own content, but also to help us mature and improve the content of our profiles within the CA baseline. So we're going to talk about 4 of these mechanisms that are available today, and we're going to drill a little into the conditions where they're going to be kind of most helpful to certain types of implementers at certain parts of their own journey. All right, next. So the first one that we're really going to start off with is what we consider kind of the most flexible approach that ultimately can be applied at the earliest levels of maturity if you're looking at the CA baseline and starting to you know, want to align your particular guidance to the profiles that have been developed. Informal alignment is not a mechanism per se, like some of the others, but it is the approach that the Canadian standards community has been taking for the last 2 or so years, you know, to align our guides and profiles to what essentially is the earliest draft of the baseline. It's pretty much a visual, very manual comparison of the profile differential, and it's essentially just noting kind of, you go through, you know, what the cardinality and the must support flag constraints are that have been taken in the Canadian baseline, what terminology has been recommended, and then try to carry that over manually into your profile. So to say, okay, I can see it's this, and I'm going to try to apply the same decision making. The biggest benefit of this approach is that it really doesn't force you, because it's not mechanical, to inherit all the constraints. So it makes it a really good choice for developers and implementers who are maybe a little bit closer to developing specs for production level systems that are maybe more averse to changes and refinements that are going to kind of be forthcoming in the baseline. It's also really important that it allows for deviation from the CA baseline when it's appropriate. So Mike alluded to the kind of 80-20 rule that we follow. A lot of times we come across a fringe use case or, you know, implementer where the CA baseline profile really isn't appropriate to derive from. And so this allows for them to kind of go through this process of trying to align where it is possible, but ultimately not forcing hands if something isn't necessarily appropriate, or perhaps we've made a choice that might not be something that stays long-term within the CA baseline. Now, the downside of this approach, however, is that we don't have full transparency, or really any transparency, on who is using this approach. And ultimately that increased the risks of, you know, missing places where within the CA baseline, we might have been overly restrictive. And so it's really critical that, you know, if you're out there and you begin to use this approach, that you have that communication upward to the CA baseline team when you identify a constraint that you can't reasonably carry over into your own guide. And we ask that you do so using our simplifier issue log, which we'll show at the end of the presentation. You know, as our baseline profiles do become more mature and stable, this still remains a pretty good approach for folks, you know, who have other reasons for not inheriting constraints directly. So one example of this we point out to in particular is, you know, there are going to be some profiles that look to the CA baseline but already have a very nested structure. Like we see this sometimes around some types of observations where you've reprofiled once or twice already. Those are going to be cases where you might not want to have to reprofile directly from the CA baseline, even if it is very stable, and we would recommend informal alignment in those particular cases. All right, next slide. So the next approach, which is instance validation, we consider to be a little bit less flexible, but more narrowly scoped in how an implementer can use this mechanism. So that's why it kind of falls within that area in the axes. And when we talk about instances in the community, we're typically talking about, you know, examples that ultimately are trying to model the constraints that are outlined in the particular specification. So, you know, just because I'm, you know, say I'm developing examples for the Prescribed IT implementation guide, that doesn't mean I also can't validate those same examples against the rules that are set out in non-prescribed profiles. So, for instance, the CA baseline. And I do so really by identifying within that example file that I'm creating the profile or profiles that I would like to validate the instance against. And so you would run that through one of the validator tools and receive information back from the tool indicating, you know, are there errors, are there warnings? Did I break a particular rule that was outlined in one of the profiles I asked to check against? So let's say your patient example, you know, that you modeled after your minimum representation of, you know, constraints in your profile. Let's say that example didn't include a patient name because maybe your profile doesn't require, you know, given and family name are both be present. This approach would help identify that gap, because in the CA baseline, we do in fact have essentially an invariant rule that says, make sure that either given, family, or both be present, where, we know that not everyone in the community has that rule themselves. And so it's a really good way to kind of have that really quick check against oftentimes cardinality, but also invariant rules that are present within the guide. So it works really well in those spaces, but it doesn't cover validation of the other profiling kind of action or decision that we often take, which is in the application of must support flags. These tend to be a little bit trickier areas to assess alignment. So I would we wildly encourage folks to have this approach in your arsenal. But we also recognize it has its own limitations, and you're likely going to have to combine it with some of the other approaches that we'll talk about today in order to develop kind of a high confidence or guarantee that you're going to be aligned to the baseline. All right, the next slide. Perfect. So this next one is the iGuide dependencies mechanism or approach. And this one, on the other hand, really allows you to kind of reference iGuide content, like oftentimes it's extensions and profiles and value sets, without having to rebuild that content in your own implementation guide packages. So let's say you're in BC and you want to leverage the Aboriginal Identity Group extension. We've socialized that within the baseline. It's been created so that it can essentially be pointed to. You'd be able to include the CA baseline as one of your guide dependencies. And then you're not stuck maintaining and having to change this extension over time. You don't have to duplicate it just for the purposes of passing validation. And by including this implementation guide dependency, that doesn't necessarily mean that it forces you to use really any or any specific content or all content of the baseline, but it is a particularly helpful approach for folks who, you are going to be developing profiles that rely on, often nationally standardized extensions and terminologies. So in the baseline, a lot of the extensions that we've surfaced to date are a little bit more focused on patient and practitioner, because it's what we have the most information based on, the activities that have been happening in our FHIR communities to date. So folks, if you're working on client and provider registries, this is actually a really great approach for you to start implementing as soon as you can, because we want to encourage the reuse of these already existent extensions and encourage you not to have to just duplicate for the sake of duplication. Now, the downside of this approach is that it works best when you have a very stable versioned package that you can point to, which, from our baseline perspective, it's coming very soon, but it isn't available this very instant. And we'll talk a little bit about, when is this particular mechanism going to be, most ideal to start implementing within the next, short time frame. Next. So Mike is going to talk to this in a few minutes, but we are going to want to talk a little bit more about that package release cycle, particularly about our movement to maturity level 1, which we are hoping to kind of process through before the end of the beginning of the new year. We're intending to kind of make that announcement on the InfoCentral forum when we have released the package, but you can also subscribe for updates using the subscribe button on our FHIR project for the CA baseline, or reach out to Mike and I directly if you're interested in getting your hands and knowing exactly when it gets fresh off the presses. We've showed some screenshots here just showing the mechanism, how it actually comes into action, so that if you are representing a team when you're reviewing this content, you can actually kind of provide this to them and show them just how simple it is to actually write another iGuide dependency into your projects. We've done it for a number of iGuides in the province. We'd heavily encourage it. We're also including a link in the screen to some of the documentation that the FHIR lead team that's behind FHIR has put together, particularly on how to manage and create package dependencies if you are a project that is working in FHIR today. So please feel free to take a look through the content that other folks have already put together in this space. Next. Perfect. Okay, so the last mechanism that we're going to go over is called reprofiling. And in terms of, the 4, this is the most rigid in terms of an approach for adopting the baseline, but it also comes forward with the most benefits. So, by indicating your profile is based on the CA baseline, what you're essentially doing is like copying and pasting all the work that we've already done in this space. So you only have to write, quote unquote code for the things that you care about that weren't originally touched on in the baseline profile. So let's say you're in Manitoba, for instance, and you've got a pharmacy service that you're developing a medication request profile for, and you find that the constraints of the baseline already cover maybe 2/3 of the elements in your requirements, but maybe you want to make dosage instruction text have a rule where it's always populated for every prescription. Reprofiling lets you do just that while cutting down the time and the effort it's going to take to author your profile, with the added benefit of, through this process, reinforcing, a minimum set of requirements that are shared across all Canadian FHIR implementation for prescription profiles, regardless of what jurisdiction, regardless of what vendor you're using. I like to say, and I think I'm going to get this put on a t-shirt, that standards are like the one and maybe only industry where plagiarism is widely accepted and actually heavily encouraged, because it's meant for the purposes of the greater good, right? So we want to be able to leverage and reuse each other's work wherever possible. And by reusing it, we're actually improving the quality of content that's in our community. This is why it's one of the approaches that we're recommending to jurisdictional governance bodies and the working groups, to employ for their forthcoming FHIR content. We understand this is going to take a lot of trust and assurance that the baseline profiles are ready for trial use. That also means that we'll need to communicate that changes will be controlled, and there'll be mechanisms for implementers, to surface those true blockers in their ability to reprofile. And so before we get to that point, and as part of that process, we're asking early adopters to begin trialing this approach against their own use cases, and to surface areas where they are getting hung up on, when trying to reprofile through our simplifier issue log. So just to be clear, we're not, asking for production implementations to start doing this right off the bat, but we do need early testers in this community to try to catch some of our blind spots in order to actually advance our maturity level of the content, so that we can eventually get to that point where we can ask production systems to confidently begin, utilizing this particular approach. Next. So you can actually begin doing this today. There's nothing that's stopping you from reprofiling, our level 0 kind of draft profiles, but we are just finishing up some light housekeeping on the profiles this month. So there may be a few constraints that you see relaxed in the next, few weeks that are ultimately kind of coming out of actions that have come from our due diligence process that I think Mike is going to speak to in a minute. But we just wanted to share a few images just to show you again how easy it is to actually implement this approach. If you're nervous about doing this, or you haven't reprofiled before, you just want to talk about, some of the things that are keeping you from trying this out as one of those early adopters and testers, please, please, please reach out to Mike or I. We're willing to kind of do whatever means necessary to educate the community about the benefits and to help them actually kind of trial this out in a safe and understandable way. We know that this is key to advancing the standard, and we're willing to kind of work with your team and kind of walk them through this. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Mike, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the work we've done to date to get these profiles to a place that you can confidently start using them and trial them in this way.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Sheridan. That was all fantastic. So folks, yeah, as Sheridan just mentioned, what she's done a great job of thus far is going through a lot of sort of the what and the how in terms of the adoption of these profiles. So let's talk a little bit about just really, the questions that a lot of you may have had going into looking at this, which is really the when. So in terms of when will these profiles be mature enough for you to use, right? Ultimately, though, there's really no one right answer. It really just depends more on you and your teams or your implementations and where you're at and where you're comfortable in terms of your actual implementation. If you're wanting, and if it's a type of project where informal alignment is what you're after, that's something that you can be doing now. And it's already being done by authors and implementers in not one, but even several different jurisdictions and different projects. We definitely want to, and that all that said, we still, of course, want people to continue to close that loop and give us feedback, ask us questions, as Sheridan has mentioned. We're absolutely ready, willing, and able to be having those conversations. Similarly with the other ones like instance validation and reprofiling, that's something that people can be doing now. Again, we say that with the caveat that we do want to make sure that we have some relationships that we can build with you in terms of understanding how you'll be testing and providing feedback to improve and increase the maturity of our profiles as you're going through and working with the profiles. And then again, this is something that Sheridan also alluded to when she had gone through the approach of the iGuide dependencies. That's one that we're sort of labeling as soon, and again, not just soon, but very much in the short term. as we continue to tighten up our profiles and resolve some of those different issues. And I'll speak a little bit to the actual maturity spectrum that we're on in a short moment. But one thing just really wanted to call out in terms of the work that we're doing right now and what we've been doing, especially over the last year and a bit, is what we've been calling the due diligence review. This has really been one of our main mechanisms toward maturing the Canadian baseline profiles. It's been a great way not just to engage the community in our work, but also to directly be looking at and working with the Canadian live implementation FHIR implementation guides that are out there right now. Again, this is a process where we really just will spend our meeting times lining up the Canadian baseline profiles with their relevant profiles as they're defined and profiled in these other implementation guides, and looking at the constraints that are placed in the baseline, comparing again against the constraints that are provided in those implementation guides, and looking at where there are constraints in the I guides that we might want to inherit into the baseline profiles, or if we're going through enough different I guides and we're noticing that the Canadian baseline might have a particularly strict cardinality or a tighter value set binding than all these other guides, it's something that we might take that as a hint that we may have been a little bit overly prescriptive in the way that we had drafted the Canadian baseline profile for that particular resource, and that we may flag that as a candidate for relaxation. So those are the types of decisions that come out of these different conversations and these different discussions. And to date, we've actually gone through a very long list of FHIR implementation guides, and the ones that you see on the slide here are really just a few for your information around just sort of the depth and breadth of different use cases, jurisdictions, as well as again, just the different types of iGuides that we've been looking at. So something that we've put in a lot of work on, and it's really to this due diligence review that's got us to a point where we can start looking at tightening up the maturity of the profiles. So again, it's been a lot of great work and a lot of great input from the communities, as well as even the participants from the iGuides themselves that have provided added context to us. So again, if you're not already familiar with our work, really hoping that you can appreciate from this just how much time and again, as the name suggests, how much due diligence we've put into our work so far. In terms of the maturity levels themselves, this is really the set of maturity levels that we've defined. Again, these are provided in a bit more condensed, especially in the middle for simplicity's sake here. But the maturity levels that we've defined and declared here are the product of also synthesizing the types of maturity level definitions from a lot of other baseline or core styled profile sets from across the world. So we had looked at the UK core, the New Zealand and Australia core, certainly the US core as well as also just HL7 itself, really doing our best to synthesize the most reasonable parts of all of those to define these to define these levels. So where we're at currently right now is still at maturity level 0, but as Sheridan mentioned, we're well on our way toward maturity level 1 in terms of this progression. And we're really looking at this by certainly our estimates are no later than winter 2022 that will be at maturity level 1. We're actively involved right now in the Canadian FHIR baseline profiles initiative, the workstream itself, on ensuring that we're not to achieve maturity level 1, that the list of baseline profiles are not returning any errors or warnings. So again, what we've been working consistently week by week on doing has been getting us to maturity level 1. And again, the closer we get to there, that'll open up other doors and other opportunities for us to even further work through the maturity levels. So really, again, hoping that this has all been informative for folks, especially for those of you who are not as intimately familiar with the work. Again, for those who are more familiar with the work, but have wanted to know sort of how far along we are and when and how you might start being able to adopt these. Really hoping that this has given you the confidence and also the information to continue to watch this with a very purposeful set of eyes. The other thing, and again, it's Sheridan and I can't emphasize this enough, that we want to start building these relationships with you if you're interested and curious and ready to start taking our baseline profiles as your starting point. There are a number of different resources. Firstly, to just get involved with us in general. it'll be great to have you in the InfoCentral FHIR implementers community, of which the Canadian baseline profiles is one defined work stream. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see the link to join there, create an InfoCentral account for free, and then start joining us for our regularly occurring meetings. When you're actually looking from a tooling perspective at checking out the baseline iGuides, you'll refer to the right-hand side of the screen where you can see our baseline as it's published on IG Publisher, as well as simplifier.net. If you have feedback and you have issues or comments you want to contribute about our profiles, the simplifier.net issue log would be the best place to contribute to those specific profiles. So again, really hoping to hear from you. And this is one of those where we are very much looking forward to seeing some new faces and hearing some new names as we continue to do this work as a product of having heard from us here. So again, really hoping that that you've taken out as much as possible from this presentation, and hope to see you over on the InfoCentral FHIR implementers community soon. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.